I'm Chris McDonough, a retired homicide detective. I've interviewed thousands of people, from serial killers to ministers. Welcome to the interview room.
Well, first going back to your other question, I, being a little younger here, kind of live on social media. And it was shocking how much involvement was going on in the general public with the Idaho case from the get-go. There's just a massive surge of true crime coverage. These internet sleuth groups, there's ethics questions arising in these places. I actually almost likened it to a live ongoing murder mystery going on for the last few months, but you're talking about real people for young people that lost their lives. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle. Just going back to what you were saying before. In regards to Kohberger and my dad, so my dad was 28 when he committed his first murders. It was part of the Otero family in January of 74. So my father went from breaking and entering, stalking, what he called trolling for victims, simple burglary of lingerie and stuff. So he went from that to an attempted kidnapping. He reported them in the fall of 73, straight into what was his first murders. Now he's a serial killer because he committed, 6 more murders after that, 7 scenes in total. But if he had been caught after his first one, we would call him a mass murderer. So one of my questions tonight for the panel when we get there is, was Kohberger a budding serial killer? We have to call him a mass murderer because he's been caught. But I don't believe he would have been stopped. I believe we were looking at a serial killer. I don't know if we're allowed to use that term here. I mean, we can't, but if he had continued. Also, with my father then being the same age, entering in a house with multiple people, my father actually didn't even expect the adult male to be home when he did enter in 74. So he got into a situation he was not fully prepared for, and he had to call it what he calls improvising. I believe Kohberger maybe didn't know how many people were in the house. In my opinion, I believe he was maybe targeting the young women on the 3rd floor, ran into people awake on the 2nd floor. My father wouldn't have left anybody alive if he could have. He did have one person that survived his second one in 74, but that was not intentional. So my question is, was Kohberger aware there were 2 surviving women in that house? And how did he feel when he found that out after it became news? The differences between them, my father is a strangler, so there was only one stabbing in 74, and that's only because he had to finish it quickly, in his own words, and he didn't like it. So there was a big difference there in my father's MO and Kohberger's choice of weapons, and my father doesn't like blood. I would assume Kohberger's highly attracted to it, so there's a big difference there. Another important thing about my father is he was a criminology student, so he studied criminal justice at Wichita State. He literally went into classes right around the same time he committed his first murders. Then he had access to means and methods, getting to talk to law enforcement while they were working the BTK cases. So he murdered 7 people in the 70s while studying his own crimes in classes and enjoying that and basically making fun of them and mocking them in his head while they were sitting there trying to figure out who this murderer is, while wearing possibly Mr. Otero's watch. My father stole trinkets and mementos. So he was walking around with wearing Otero's watch, possibly seen at the second murder. So that's another question I have. Did the law enforcement find anything in Kohberger's apartment, mementos? I would assume possibly, but we're gonna have to see.
Awesome. Yep.
Yeah. So right after Kohberger was arrested, it came out that he studied under Dr. Catherine Ramsland in his undergrad and master's program at DeSales University in Pennsylvania. I deal with PTSD, one of the joys of my life. And I was relieved to hear that Kohberger had been arrested. I instantly was sort of back to my own 2005 arrest of my father and, how that was handled. And then thinking of Kohberger's family and their no-knock warrant. And then when I heard the Ramsland connection, I got really ill, nauseated, and was dealing with active PTSD for about a day. I wasn't going to say anything publicly, and then it was kind of getting ahead of me in the media. And so I made a statement simply on Twitter. And then my life went nuts for a few weeks, and now here I am. I had concerns that Kohberger could have contacted my father via letters. It's very common for the general public to write my father. It can be common, especially with criminology students. So I had put that concern out there. So of course, my father has access to TV and radio, newspapers. So TMC contacted my father through a jail app called Getting Out. I didn't even know my father had electronic communication. So as a victim, I had to process that. That took about a day. Finding out through the media, my father had electronic communication. I verified it, that it was actually, he does have access to this app. And my father said no, that he had not had contact with Kohberger. But he said he was sure Kohberger had studied him in class, which of course we know. I mean, especially under Dr. Ramsland and her Dangerous Mind serial killer class, obviously my father would be studied. As Ramsland's basically an expert on my father. And then my father wanted to make sure and point out that, my family, that he loved my family very much, but we haven't been in contact. So he wanted to push that in there, let everybody in the world know that, because he's a narcissist. And then he mentioned he wanted to compare his own crimes to Kohberger's. And so he educated all of us in that way too. My father is a sexual sadistic psychopath, pathological liar, and a narcissist. So whenever you're talking about my father, you need to keep those things in mind. So giving my father a microphone, this is what happens very quickly, where he has to insert himself back in and bring up his own crimes and make sure people are paying attention to him. It's just my father. It's never been any different for my father.
Thank you for your revealing your brutal soul honesty here in terms of what you've been, suffering all of these years. I think everybody on this panel, we understand that we don't understand what you've experienced, and nor could we ever. But we do understand that you have survived something that is of a depth that I don't think the human condition, unless you've been in it, is capable of quite, grasping, wrapping their mind around it. And, thank you for your willingness to put it out there for a moment there, because I know that's not very easy. But at the same time, I respect you for the fact that I really know that deep down inside you feel the importance of what your mission is through your advocacy to helping these types of problems. And so thank you for sharing just even that little piece of who you are. I'm grateful for that.
Well, it had been reported that Kohberger had moved to Washington by August because his first stalking incident was around the 22nd. But then 2020 had just run a special where somebody was doing haircuts on Kohberger, and she showed a screenshot that he had received a haircut as early as July 7th. Now, that's the earliest I had seen reported of him being in Washington. I haven't seen that anywhere else. I was sure it was August. He would have graduated from DeSales. They had a walk in May, but they were in quarters. And so he was still finishing classes in June based on my research. So he wrapped up classes the end of June, about the 30th. So he maybe was out of Washington by the 7th. I did question that date. I haven't been able to authenticate if it was July or August, but we do know that he was there by August. One of my questions was, we found out that Washington State University has access to a crime lab with cameras. Now, there was a whole process to be able to access those cameras, a screening process, and signing in and signing out with locked doors. Fox News reported this. My question is, because of how easy it is to access body cams, and Kohberger was studying cyber forensics. So I'm wondering, is it possible, could he have forwarded like FOIA body cams before the murders to stalk these women cyberly? I mean, that's one of my questions that's out there that we don't know, because I'm sure there would have to be records if he did, try to access these records, or did he get into that lab? We don't know. And another question then, going back to Gary, did he travel out there in March possibly to visit the university or to apply to the PhD program? I don't think that's been answered. I do know he was taking some of his master's courses remotely, but he was also on campus because there's reports of him arguing with Dr. Ramslin and having access to the DeSales crime lab. So there was a combination of online and in-person classes. Plus, you have to remember that's during COVID, so he was more remote. So I agree with Gary, he maybe could have been traveling around. So while they need to be checking Pennsylvania, they might need to be checking other unsolved crimes and other weird oddities. So the question is, did he target and fixate on them in August when he was driving around, what my father would call trolling, or was he cyber stalking them earlier through their social media? That's another thing I've wondered about. So my father was in the military in the he was supposed to go to college and he was terrible at it. So he knew, my grandpa told him, you're going to get drafted. My grandpa was a World War II veteran. And my dad has 3 younger brothers. And my grandpa said, look, you guys are going to get drafted, so you need to just go sign up. So my father was in the Air Force from 66 to 70. Now, he didn't see any action, but he traveled overseas into Turkey and Korea and Japan. And he actually was experimenting with bondage with prostitutes, according to my father, in Asia. One of his first sexual experiments then. Earlier, you were talking about the Kohberger and the young woman. There's a lot of immaturity with somebody like my father. He had a hard time with women in high school, didn't really know how to approach them, or got too fixated on them, got kind of lovesick is a word my father used. My father really didn't have any relationships until he met my mom. It was a quick 9 months, and then they got married. So my father did have what, as far as we know, is a natural, normal, almost and a loving relationship with my mom, but there is still an immaturity to my father. Like with my father's crimes, they were very sexually motivated, but he never raped. He would masturbate next to the victims after their deaths or while they were dying, but there wasn't like a penetration type rape or anything like that. That would have, to my father, that was crossing the line. Even my father has lines, and that was one of his lines. Back to the the security guard stuff. No, my father, after the military, my dad loved badges and uniforms. He just loved to he loved to have a uniform, even if it was just to take the garbage out. It looked different than taking out the trash and walking the dog. He loved his Boy Scout uniform. He was never a cop. I swear to the Lord that he took the test to be a cop, but the police said, no, I swear he went in and did it. He was always like sort of a wannabe, wanted to be a cop. So he was a compliance officer. He was in ADT, so he was in security. So after the Otero murders, there was a big upswing in Wichita community families wanting to have security systems. And so my father actually got a job installing security systems because of the crimes he had committed. And he always enjoyed that little irony that he was in people's houses, why they were all very scared of him. And then in 91, he became a compliance officer in Park City in the suburbs we live north of Wichita. And he totally overhauled the whole thing. His uniform, he created a uniform and had a badge, and he had a nightstick and a knife, and he carried a shotgun in his truck. And he looked like something right out of like a country sheriff, like literally down to the brown uniform. And he worked down the hall from the cops. And then he kept all of his BTK binders and whatnot in his office down the hall from the cops and thought that was all very fun too. D'Angelo, Golden State, he was a cop and a criminology student. So he's another big one that has that same sort of profile. Back to your question, did Kohberger, do I think that he went into criminology for what we call white hat purposes, or did he already know he had the chance to be a black hat? I think it was probably both. I know my father really wished he had just been a normal person. It was a huge struggle, like you were talking about, back to childhood, of kind of fighting off those demons and then finally just giving into them. And then once you cross that line, it gets easier and easier after that. So I do believe, based on what you're saying and what we know, Kohberger struggled with a lot of those same things that we know my father did and many of these type of predators.